はじめまして、私の名前は Harvey Sharon です。Hello everyone, it's lovely to be here with you today, and I'm going to start my presentation by sharing my screen. So today I'm talking to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand, about communicating with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. In New Zealand, we call these cold communities, culturally and linguistically diverse, and particularly focusing on communicating with these communities in crises, including short-term events, as well as long crises like the COVID pandemic. And my focus will be on using plain English because I think there's quite a lot of interest in Japan on using plain Japanese in communicating with your multilingual communities. There's two pictures here. The top picture is a snapshot of just a few of our very multiculturally diverse students in schools. And the lower picture is one of our interpreters using New Zealand Sign Language to interpret information on COVID-19. So I went looking for recent literature on communicating with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and one very recent article was by O'Brien and Frederici, who made the point that with increased people displacement, for example, I'm talking about refugees there, and large-scale economic migration across the world, there are major concerns for migrants' adaptability to disasters in their new countries and contexts. Although we know refugees and immigrants can be really resilient because they've sometimes, particularly refugees, been through really tough experiences in the past, but they may be exposed to new vulnerabilities in their new environments because they have limited access to information. And they often have limited access to information because they may not share the dominant language of the country that they find themselves in. So local crises in multilingual societies have implications for temporary or long-term residents with limited proficiency in the local language. And of course, when we're thinking of temporary residents, we can also include tourists in that situation. And people in the following categories are most at risk of not understanding public messages in a public health crisis like COVID-19. So as we've said, people in migrant communities. And out of those communities, the even more vulnerable might be older people who haven't been to school in the country in which they live. Typically, people might speak English, or in your case, Japanese, better than they read it. So they may have picked up their spoken English in New Zealand from speaking to other people in the community, but they may not have learned to read it so well. But if they have learned to read English, or in your case, Japanese, they may have learned to read a different register than the one in which we most usually communicate public health communication, for example. So they may be unfamiliar with technical medical written English or legal English. And as it says here, both are often used in public health communication. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about Aotearoa and New Zealand. I'm sure you've heard of our country, but you may not be aware just how super diverse New Zealand is. And that super diversity is framed by the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840 between the British Crown and the tangata whenua, or Indigenous people of New Zealand Maori. So New Zealand has a relatively small population compared to Japan, about 5 million people. But surprisingly, perhaps, over 160 languages are spoken in the community, and some of those languages are spoken by just a few people. So it's quite a challenge for the New Zealand government. Also, 27.4% of the population of New Zealand were born overseas. 41% of people in Auckland were born overseas. These are massive proportions of our population who have migrated here quite recently. English is the main language in New Zealand due to colonisation by Great Britain in the early 1800s. And Te Reo Māori, or the Maori language, is New Zealand's Indigenous language and an official language. And it has been an official language since 1987. And New Zealand Sign Language is also an official language since 2006. And just to give you an idea of the main languages that are spoken in New Zealand, these are the top 20 from the 2013 census. So you'll see that English is spoken by far by the majority, Maori next, Samoan next, Hindi next, and then the Northern Chinese languages of Mandarin being the most prominent. And you'll see over on the right-hand side that Japanese figures in our top 20 languages as well. We do have some Japanese migrants in New Zealand, but most of those people who say that they can speak in Japanese have learnt Japanese through the New Zealand education system. So that's possibly interesting. Okay, so just to run over New Zealand's recent disasters and tragedies, I am aware that our losses haven't been anything like that, for example, of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in 2011. But for a small population, they've been significant and traumatic, I would say, for New Zealand. So we had one of our recent earthquakes, the Canterbury earthquake in 2010. We had the Christchurch earthquake, which is perhaps the most well-known, in 2011. And we had another earthquake in Kaikoura, close by, in 2016. We had the Christchurch mosque killings in 2019 and the White Island volcanic eruption in 2019. So you can see, particularly with the Christchurch mosque killings, but also in the case of the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, culturally and linguistically diverse communities were involved, and emergency services were required to communicate under emergency with those communities. Just an overview of COVID in New Zealand. We've had 2,340 cases so far of COVID. They are coming into New Zealand regularly because New Zealanders are returning home. We've had 26 deaths. And I have to say, as an applied linguist, the government COVID communication has been excellent. It's been in plain English, it's been clear, concise, repetitive, visually distinct, and what you might call a model of excellent marketing. It's been followed up by many other organisations seeking to echo government messaging around COVID. And also our COVID communication has been in a number of languages. So this is just to give you a taste of New Zealand's COVID public communication. You can see that it's visually distinct with the yellow, not horizontal, the yellow diagonal stripes, and very clear messages there with "we can all slow the spread." And the written messages are backed up by small pictures that we are all now familiar with in New Zealand. So in that message on the left-hand side, the first thing you can see there is a heart, and that's the first message of the Prime Minister, be kind. The next one is obviously wash your hands, then sneeze into your elbow, and the one with a little house around the person means stay home if you're ill. And then on the right-hand side, we have, again, unite against COVID-19, the idea that New Zealand's doing this together, and very clearly a message from the New Zealand government. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see this repetition of messages, unite against COVID-19, and the big heart sign there saying, be kind. And a few more messages from the New Zealand government, and you can just see this constant repetition, be kind, stay home, save lives. In the bottom left-hand corner, New Zealand is now at alert level 3. And up in the top right-hand corner there, you can see explanations of our alert levels. And as summer started in New Zealand, we had a new message coming through that was backed up by television advertisements, signs everywhere, and also online advertisements saying, make summer unstoppable. And there's our pictures there. Wash your hands, stay home if you're ill, and use the COVID Tracer app, turn on your Bluetooth, and you unite against COVID-19. So the Make Summer Unstoppable campaign was to convince New Zealanders that the way to have a great summer, stay at the beach, see all your friends, was to do the right thing in terms of keeping COVID-19 at bay. And we had translations into a number of languages, and these are some of the languages that the COVID-19 information was translated into. But of course, I haven't counted these, but this might be about 20 languages. And as I've said, we have 160 languages at least in the community in New Zealand. So there are questions really about how to reach those smaller communities when they don't speak and read English, as well as the mainstream population. And I guess one of the techniques is around using plain English. So after the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, a group of people were brought together to talk about best practice guidelines of engaging with culturally and linguistically diverse communities in times of disaster. And it's a very good report that I would recommend to you. And in this lovely picture on the right-hand side, you can see some of the Somali community women preparing food. The key message of the report is that if you want to communicate well with called communities following disaster, or indeed during disaster times, don't wait until something really bad happens. Get to know them now, build a relationship with called communities based on mutual trust, respect, and understanding. In a sense, once the disaster strikes, it's a little bit too late. You have to put that effort into knowing the communities first. So that was a key message from that report. And a few other points from the report that I'd like to share with you are that access to information in an understandable way is a human right, especially in an emergency. I'm sure you all feel that deeply. And of course, there aren't just language barriers with called communities, with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. There are also cultural barriers. So the kinds of people that we want to be communicating with our diverse communities are people who have good intercultural skills. And there are several possibilities depending on the situation for communication with cold communities. There's the requirement, of course, for translation in many situations, particularly with COVID in the case of public health information. We need people with diverse languages and interpreting skills. And the other strategy is to use plain English so that people recognise the English and can understand it. So just a few hints here about what plain English means and how you might go about using it. So first of all, plain English is the language that the audience is hopefully familiar with. And as I said before, you need to know your audience to get this right. So the first idea is to use short, clear sentences. This is an emergency, as an example. Just one idea per sentence. For example, stay home if you feel sick. Not stay home, do this, do that if you feel sick. Just one idea per sentence. Short paragraphs, so people understand what the topic of the paragraph is and then get some detail and then move on. Avoid long words wherever short ones will do. For example, use the word wash rather than sanitize, because many people know what wash is, but they may not know what sanitize means. Avoid jargon. In New Zealand, if things are okay, or we hope things will be okay, we say, she'll be right, mate. Well, that may not be understandable to our migrant communities, and we might want to use more mainstream or plain English like everything will be okay. Explain all the acronyms, because not everybody understands them. For example, MERS-CoV, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Use active verbs. We can all slow the spread. Be polite. And in English, we would say please, thank you. And I know that Japanese people are very polite as well. Address the reader listener directly. We will keep looking after you during the COVID-19 pandemic. Make instructions clear. Be kind. And using lists are okay, because they're a clear way of demonstrating what people have to do or what they have to prepare for. So those ideas about plain English are from that Christchurch City Council report of 2012, and I do recommend it to you. I think it's a really good report. Here I've got an example of how languages have been mixed to target a particular community. And in this case, it's Indigenous people of New Zealand, or Maori. And it's directed at people living in Auckland, explaining what's happening at alert level 2. And it's written in Te Reo Māori and plain English, interestingly. So at the top it says whānau, living in Tamaki, alert level 2. So the words that are in italics are Te Reo Māori. So that heading at the top means family living in Auckland, alert level 2. Whānau can go to work and school if they aren't mauiwi. So that means family can go to work and school if they aren't sick. Kura, Kohanga and Punareo are open for our tamariki. So that means schools and early childhood centres are open for our children. Hui and gatherings are restricted to 100 people. Hui there means meetings. Whānau are asked to check out the locations of interest here to see if they need to stay home and get tested. Again, whānau means family. Face coverings must be worn on buses, trains, and most ferries, and there's no Maori there, you may notice. So the idea here is that this appeals and draws in Maori people to read it. All Maori in New Zealand can read English, but this addresses them in ways that they're used to communicating with each other, and also increasingly with New Zealand institutions. And here's a few common plain English messages that we use in New Zealand. You might be familiar with them in Japan. So stop, drop and roll in the case of fire. So if people have fire on their clothing, they should stop, drop to the floor and roll to put out the fire. In an earthquake, drop, cover and hold. Drop to the floor, cover your head and hold on to something that's sturdy. And you can see that picture in the bottom right-hand corner. And here's one that we see a lot around New Zealand, being an island country. If an earthquake is long or strong, get gone. And so that's that plain English, clear messaging there. Move immediately to the nearest high ground or as far inland as possible. Don't wait for an official tsunami warning. I've talked a little bit already about the need for intercultural competence as well as using appropriate language with diverse communities. And I think it's important to realise that intercultural competence isn't one thing, it's a combination of attitudes, knowledge, understanding and skills. So we do need to understand and respect people with different cultural affiliations. We need to respond appropriately, effectively and respectfully when interacting and communicating with people. And as I said previously, it's important to establish positive and constructive relationships with your diverse communities, hopefully before crises. And in order to work constructively with other cultures, it's really helpful to be reflective about yourself and your own understandings about diversity and culture. Barrett et al., Barrett and other authors in 2014, writing for the Council of Europe, said, intercultural competence provides a foundation for being a global citizen. But I would say in multicultural communities like New Zealand and increasingly in Japan, intercultural competence is also about being a good citizen at home. And a little bit of provocation here about language policies and thinking about language education policies in the context of health and health crises and natural disasters. So there was an article written just last year by Zhang and Wu, and they were writing as a result of observing and researching what happened in Wuhan at the beginning of the pandemic there. And the point they made was that they really needed access to a number of languages that were hard to source in Wuhan, because of the multicultural and multilingual communities living in Wuhan at the time, but also because they needed to speak to people in a lot of countries to quickly get PPE, that's personal protective equipment, into Wuhan. They weren't prepared for a pandemic of the kind that COVID-19 was. So they made some suggestions about language education policy as a result of the research that they did. And they perhaps provocatively said, abandon English monolingual ideologies and develop national approaches to language, to diverse language competence for strategies that meet the language needs of diverse populations at local, national and global levels. They said that foreign language education policies need to de-centre English as the language of international communication, because not everybody speaks it, and it's not necessarily the best language to communicate in an effective way with everybody. They said that China, in this case, needs to give due importance to training in less commonly taught languages. And they suggested that governments, as the leaders in crisis management, should formulate an effective emergency language service system. And I'm just putting that out as a provocation to you. Is this too provocative, or is it a sensible approach for future crisis management? So just to go over some of the points that I've made, in this presentation. The first is to build multilingual competence through the education system, and that's a really long-term approach to managing crises in multicultural societies. Get to know your diverse communities before disaster strikes and talk to them about how they like to be communicated with. And also, of course, intercultural competence is so important there. Ensure there are ways to access diverse languages for quick translation in a crisis, and social media can be very helpful here. There's documentation that in Wuhan that worked rather well. Ensure you have diverse in-country interpreting capabilities. And the message in this presentation is use plain language when using the dominant language. So in New Zealand, that's English, and I've given you some examples of key public messages in English. And in Japan, of course, you would use Japanese. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity of addressing the seminar today, and I look forward to your responses. Thank you.